everyone, and welcome to this brand new episode of An Ingenious You, the podcast where we have conversations with higher ed's most creative thinkers and doers. Today's guest is someone I have wanted to speak with for a very long time, Dr. Bernard Bull, who serves as the 11th president of Concordia University in Nebraska. His work and his research focus on futures in education, education forecasting and trend analysis, methods and models of educational research and development, and the intersection of education and digital culture. Before Concordia, he served as president of Goddard College in Vermont, was also in Wisconsin at Concordia University as associate professor of education and vice provost, and has served as a middle and high school teacher in Lutheran schools in Illinois and Wisconsin. I love this fact, this last fact I'll mention. Throughout his career, he has taught grades 6 through 20 in Lutheran schools and universities. I think anybody who can teach at those ages and that range can probably do just about anything. And I should mention, he is an author, co-author, editor of 7 books, including a book I just really loved we're going to talk about today. Missional Moonshots, Insights and Inspiration in Educational Innovation. There's a lot more I can say, but we will include the link to his full bio in the show notes. For now, Bernard, it is such a pleasure to finally meet you and have this conversation.
Thanks, Melissa. I'm excited to be here.
So we like to start out by finding something about our guests. And on your personal website, you describe yourself as an educator, a university president, an applied researcher, writer, and designer who is passionate about championing and supporting inspired and inspiring learning, equipping people of conviction, character, courage, and compassion to be a blessing in their families, communities, churches, workplaces, and world. Wow, that is a great personal mission, vision statement. So how did the dots connect there? And what influences have most shaped who you are today and the things that you have accomplished?
Well, I think for me, I have to start pretty early in my experience. Before we started the recording, you and I were talking a little bit, and I mentioned that I moved a lot in my youth. I lived in 12 states my first 12 years. And one part of that's interesting, though, that means that I was in at least 12 different schools. I believe I was in 14 schools in my first 12 years. So my educational experience and journey was interesting. And as many might expect, if you're only in a school for that short period of time, it's difficult to make friends. And when you do, then you're saying goodbye to them very quickly. And also, many schools have a plan, a curriculum that takes you on a journey from year to year to year. And you're not really experiencing the fullness of that plan if you're jumping around from school to school. So it was a kind of interesting educational journey, but I learned about a lot of different ways that people think and talk about education. And I experienced many different approaches to education. So I remember, for example, I went from one school in a certain part of the country to another school in a very different part of the country. And their curriculum was probably 3 grade levels different. What they expected a 4th grader to do in the one school was probably closer to what the next school expected a 6th or 7th grader to be able to do. And so I think that was part of maybe prompting me to think about learning and learning communities. I also had a really life-changing kind of experience as well. In 6th grade, I was attending a local public school, and there was a bit of unrest in the school, and there were some discipline challenges. And I was riding the bus to school one day, and someone pulled me back in my seat, and I felt something cold on my neck, and it was a knife, and someone was threatening to take my life. And while this is not the optimal outcome, the principal had actually advised my parents to send me to a different school because he didn't think that I would be safe there. And you'd hate to be a school leader and feel like that's your only option, is to encourage parents to send their kids to another school. But I actually went to a small private Christian school in a town nearby, and I experienced an amazing sense of community and the way that people care for one another and know you by name and are really invested in your life. And of course, there was a really powerful faith message that was shared that was quite important to me as well. And I was only in that school for one semester before my father came home and said we were moving to a new state, from the Midwest all the way to Laredo, Texas that time.
Oh.
But this time I'm 12 years old, my father's 49, and we get there, we move into our condominium. My mother wakes me up in the middle of the night and says, honey, your father is sick. And long story short, my father died of a massive heart attack that night. And it was obviously, an intense moment. I'm sitting in the back room, and my mom's making all the phone calls to family members, and I remember this very, very direct kind of statement in my thought was the thought, your father is dead. And I just remember kind of all of the emotions that you might expect one to experience in a time of loss like that. And then all of a sudden, these messages that were shared with me in that little Christian school started coming back. Really powerful messages. Now, I know that those listening may not all come from a faith background, but that's a very important part of my formation and background. And so I remember there are Bible passages that talk about things like, I'm with you always to the end of the age. I'll never leave you, forsake you. And these passages that were shared with me were an incredible sense of strength and comfort in that moment of grief and loss. And so if nothing else, later on, as I've reflected on that, I mean, that communicated to me the incredible power of a learning community and a mission-minded learning community, and the kind of impact that it can have on the life of a person. Of course, this one was specifically spiritual, but there can also be other kinds of really amazing impacts that happen in the lives of people in other ways as well. And so those were some really formative experiences. And I'll just share one more, but I'm going to fast forward about 10 years or so. So this led me on a whole journey of eventually wanting to serve in specifically Lutheran schools, because that was the kind of school that had been there for me in that critical moment of my life. But when I graduated from college and I had my first position, I was teaching social studies and religious studies at a Lutheran school. I was also serving as the technology coordinator. I was working on some new initiatives, some experiential learning initiatives that I gotten excited about. I read voraciously by that time of my life. I was reading a book or more a week, just learning about anything and everything that I could. And I also got really addicted to interviewing for different positions and telling them that I wasn't necessarily very committed, but I just wanted to learn about the organization. So I probably went through 100+ interviews in my first years, and I'd learn about different organizations that way. And I started a consulting business. The first business that I started was called Servant Innovations. And it was to help, especially nonprofits, prepare for uncertain futures and to figure out how to adjust and adapt to changing environments and contexts. And that kind of emerged from my own reading and interest. I probably wasn't particularly qualified to do all the work that I was doing, but I learned as I went, and the price was right because I did a lot of pro bono work in those first years. And so they would pay me nothing, and I would give them my time and energy, and then what they would pay me in was experience and learning opportunities. And then, of course, over time, I ended up, creating another consulting. I did independent consulting later on that sort of developed from this early work. And for me, it just became intriguing to work with organizations who were mission-minded, who had a clear and compelling vision for something that would make a tangible impact in the lives of others in the world. So these were usually learning organizations, and to be a part and stand alongside them and help them discern a good, compelling, hopeful, humane, inspiring path forward. So I kind of learned by doing as I went along. So those are a few formative pieces for me in my early years.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing, especially the personal part of your trajectory. As I look at your life and your professional journey now, those dots make so much sense in terms of the pathway you've taken. Now, you have spoken about your professional journey as a calling. Can you tell us what you mean by that?
Well, a lot of it comes back to what I was sharing before. So I'm pretty grounded in that Christian faith tradition. And in the tradition that I come from, they're really sort of every single person on the planet has the same calling in a way from the perspective I come from, which of course, from the Christian perspective, there's this idea of love God. But there's another component. In my tradition, we often say, God doesn't need your good works, but your neighbor does. And so the second part is love your neighbor. And the idea is discern where your gifts and passions and abilities intersect with the needs of those around you and the needs in the world and in the community. And then invest your time and energy in those spaces. Fred Rogers is a good example of this. He also came from a faith background. He had a real passion and interest in young people and psychology and well-being of young people, their well-being emotionally, spiritually, in all different ways. He also was really disturbed. He had a kind of a discontent about the emerging technology of the day called television that was finding its way into more and more homes. And he did not feel like it was particularly positive or wholesome content that the young people were consuming. And he also had a love for music and other things like that. And so you put those together in a Venn diagram, and in the middle, you have this love your neighbor, Mr. Rogers neighborhood. He literally called it a neighborhood, and in some ways, that's the same way that I think about where to invest my time, energy. Given my experiences, my gifts and abilities, where do I seem best positioned to make a difference and be a blessing in the lives of others in the world?
Now, your first presidency, as I mentioned, was at Goddard College in Vermont. You took over the school shortly after NETCHI, the New England accrediting body, announced it had placed Goddard on probation, largely because of shaky finances and declining enrollment, I believe. 2 years later, you accepted the presidency of Concordia. And while your tenure at Goddard was short, others have described it as very impactful. So can you tell us what you did to strengthen the school? What did you learn from your experience at Goddard? And what insights do you have for other leaders who may be trying to strengthen or even save a school?
Right. So just to give a little background, it's important for people to know that Goddard is not your typical college. It's one of the original experimental colleges in the United States, originally created in response to the growth of fascism in the West, with a belief that the best way to battle fascism is to equip people who have the sense of ownership and agency to speak up and to stand up for their convictions. And so Goddard is a non-sectarian school, and it had emerged kind of from that. At one point, it was a historic work college. Every learner has a personalized learning plan. There are no letter grades. There never have been letter grades. It's all narrative feedback. So it's a truly different kind of school. It's had a number of amazing people affiliated with it over time. David Mamet, the playwright, was there. William H. Macy, the actor, the band Fish, a number of amazing jazz musicians and poets and novelists and others out of this little school that was never over 1,000 students, really, in central Vermont. And so Goddard also had a vision from the beginning. The early founders were not particularly positive about the idea of endowments. They felt like endowments could make you soft and less agile and responsive to what's happening. And so it really depended upon its financial model. It was very, very tuition dependent, almost exclusively tuition dependent. And Goddard has had sometimes ups and downs over the years. Because of the deep sense of agency and ownership, and you can imagine that can also create some tension within a community at times as well. And that was present when I was there, and it had been present at times in its past as well. The first president was there for a very, very long time, and it's gone through quite a few presidents since then. But a really powerful school. I had read pretty much everything about Goddard College. Because of my interest in experimental college or experimental schools, alternative methods of education. So I probably, I think that I probably read as much or more than anyone else on the planet about this school. And I never wanted to be a president. I was actually on sabbatical at Wesleyan University in Connecticut. I was a Jonathan D. Harber Fellow in Education and Entrepreneurship. I was working on a new book on self-directed learning at the time, teaching a course on social entrepreneurship and education. And I was reached out to by someone from a search firm asking if I'd be interested. And I honestly wasn't particularly interested at first. I began to think about it. I decided I'd put my resume or my CV and submit it. And I don't think I was actually chosen the first round. And then they came back and they looked at my background and thought, wow, this guy sure seems to have a lot of checks a lot of the boxes compared to what we're looking for. And I went out and I interviewed, and it ended up happening. And it was an incredible time. It's an amazing community. The people are just the faculty, the students. There's just this rich curiosity, creativity, a real desire for meaning and purpose, and sharing that with one another. So a lot of things. Of course, coming from my background, my kind of more conservative Christian background, it was sort of an odd mix. Some might have looked at it first, but I approached it with deep curiosity and really that genuine desire to learn how to live and love and just learn, live, and love across difference. Really, what does that look like? I think our society can really benefit from that. And so I entered the time. I did so many listening sessions. I sat down with countless people and groups and just asked a lot of questions. I learned about the books and the ideas that were important to people in the community, and I tried to devour as many of them as I possibly could, and the different pieces of literature. I tried to participate in the activity, and I failed and made lots of mistakes, throughout the time. And I think back on all the things, I wish I could have done it this way or that way. But the school was in really difficult situation, as you described. I mean, it had a multi-million-dollar deficit. It was in trouble with it wasn't actually just on probation. It was actually worse than probation initially. So my first visit, even before I started the position, was I went with the board, a couple of board members, and the dean of academics at the time, and we went to Boston and made a plea for them to give us more time, and that's when we were put on probation. And so we the enrollment had dropped down to the 300s by this time. It had a major deficit, in trouble with the U.S. It actually was being monitored by the U.S. Department of Education, as well as NECHI. I think it's 7 semesters of declining enrollment. So we really just had to get to work and dive in, and we put a strategic plan together with some wonderful partners at Goddard who helped me do that. A good focused strategic plan that focused on kind of the basics, sort of higher ed 101 type of stuff. And we just worked through it, and the team came together. I mean, there were certainly differences and dissension at times, but ultimately, when it came down to the final decisions, people came together, and we hired some great new people in marketing and admissions and other places that helped us make it through some challenging times. We rebuilt advanced in admissions and marketing and other areas, and we were able to flip around and get going on an increase in enrollment. We were able to increase our fundraising. We just kind of worked through those basic pieces, and we were able to get it to a place of growing stability. I mean, it still needs some work. The new president is still working on a lot of things there, but and the whole community, not just the president. But I was really proud of the work that we did, and I think we gave it a good fighting chance for what's next. I'd signed a 3-year contract, and I was there for, I think, 2 years and 10 months or something like that. So I left just a little bit before the end of my 3-year contract. I honestly, when I took the position, didn't know if I was going to be there for 6 months, because I didn't know if it would make it or not. But I'm really honored to have been part of that turnaround effort, and I know there's still work for them to do to strengthen and to move forward. I'm really grateful for the people there. I learned so much from them, and for the grace that they showed me in the mistakes that I made, and every leader's going to make. I could go on and on about Goddard, but it is a great experience. It was one of those, though, I'll tell you, Melissa, from an innovation standpoint. I mean, we launched some new things and new initiatives here and there, but it's one of those where, I mean, no one is questioning the sense of urgency. Everybody knew the stakes were very, very high. And so the kind of leadership and decision making in that context is very, very different than when you're trying to affect change or lead to like our new innovations in a more kind of stable, financially stable institution or something like that. So while I learned a lot from it, I think there are specific approaches to leading in that context that don't transfer particularly well to other environments and contexts.
Yeah, no, I would agree. And I'd love to hear, because there, as you know, there are a lot of colleges that are bordering on the brink of similar kinds of situations these days. And I think we're going to see more
Yeah.
as the years go on. And so if you are a new leader and that's what you find yourself facing, are there one or two things, as you look back to your experience and what you learned, one or two things in that context that are all important to have on your radar?
Yeah, I do think that it is incredibly important to listen and learn, even when you're moving very quickly, to pay attention to the current culture and context. Of course, one way is you can just disregard the entire existing culture and rebuild something new and more stable there. I mean, that's what some people do in situations like that. I came in with a real heart for the philosophy, the vision, the history, the legacy of the school. And so this is the only way to do it, but I really believe in mission-minded innovation, like innovation with a clear purpose. And if we lose sort of the fundamental core mission of an entity, what's the reason for it to exist, right? Why not just create a new organization in my mind? And that's kind of how I approached it. That's one choice that one can make, but that requires actually really getting under the hood and doing what you can as best as you can, as quickly as you can, to try to understand the history, the legacy. I found it really valuable that, I'd done enough reading where I think I could say that I knew more about the history than most of the people who were working at the organization. Not all of them. Some of them had done a lot of research. And I could speak to sort of the compelling why that has led us up to where we were at that time. So I think being able to call and invite people back to a core mission that we can all get around. So that's something that allows us to persist through those challenging times. But that compelling mission, that compelling why, and grounding your decisions in that and trying to be as consistent as possible in your decisions with that. Again, I didn't do that perfectly. And then taking that time to really listen and learn. Those were two big pieces. A lot of my work in terms of innovation and design thinking, I really love to pursue innovations that are distinct and a natural outflowing of the context and culture in which I'm serving. And so I'm not trying to just take my favorite ideas and impress them or force them upon an organization. I'm trying to look for that which will kind of logically flow from what they've done in the past.
Now, I want to talk about your book because, as I said, I really do love the title, Missional Moonshots. That in and of itself is inspiring. So where did you get the title? How did the title come about?
Well, as some might expect, the moonshot part obviously came from JFK's moonshot, in the 1960s, the challenge to send a man to the moon and bring him back safely by the end of the decade. And it was something that a lot of people thought impossible, especially given the time restraint that he added to the particular challenge or quest that he put out there. And some some will look back at that and say, well, was it worth it? I mean, there were lives that were lost in that work and that endeavor. It was not a quest that didn't come without some major sacrifices financially and even the valuable lives of some people in the process. But that's the notion of a moonshot. A moonshot is a noble quest that many around you even question as to whether or not it's possible or achievable. And yet it's the nobility of the quest, it's the meaning behind the quest that compels you to move forward, even in the face of potential risks, uncertainty, failure, other things like that. And of course, that's why the word missional is in there. It's a moonshot, but it's not just pursuing some grand innovation for the sake of innovation. It's doing it because it helps further the mission. I always think of missions as kind of untamable, wild things, that if you really listen to a mission, it drives you to do things that are uncomfortable. It drives you beyond your current circumstances. And so that's where I use the word mission with moonshot to sort of indicate this idea that it's a compelling call or sense of mission to make a difference in this particular area, even in the face of adversity, even in the face of skepticism, and even personal doubts and uncertainties.
For those who haven't read the book, and you can get it on Amazon, it's a easy download. on Amazon and other online book publishers. What do you think are the most essential takeaways? Can you just give us a few high level?
Sure. Well, the way I described it, and of course, I'm not trying to steal this title, but the idea when I wrote the book was kind of to be the equivalent of chicken soup for the educational innovator's soul. I mean, that was sort of how I was thinking of it. So in that way, that each chapter kind of stands on its own. It's almost like just an individual reflection piece of different kinds of questions and situations that one might find themselves in as an innovator, or different models or frameworks or ways of approaching common problems or challenges for innovators and people that are trying to effect change or lead towards some new and promising future that's yet to exist. And that's really what the whole book is about. And it's drawn from over 2 decades of my own work as a consultant and as an educational leader, and as a classroom teacher as well. So I try to look at it from different perspectives throughout. In terms of key takeaways, I'm not sure. I think that the relevance of each chapter kind of depends upon where someone is. I tried to write it in a way that maybe people would read from front to back, but others would just sort of page through it and say, hey, that's what I need to hear right now. And so they would read it and see if it would help them. There's a lot infused in there. Design thinking is a big part of a framework that I use. So there's a lot in there that taps into the notion of truly trying to empathize and understand the needs or the problems or the challenges that exist, and using that as a starting point. And from there, then you can begin to establish experiments and ways of testable hypotheses to figure out where you might want to go next.
Yeah, it's a very readable book. I like your what you describe in terms of chicken soup for the educational innovators, because it does have that feel. And I agree that it's something you can pick up and put down and pick back up, and you don't have to read all in one. In fact, I think the value is in reading a chapter and taking the time to reflect on it. It's a great book read, actually, for a group of people to digest and talk about the meaning. Now, I have some favorites, so let me dive a little deeper here. Chapter 5, I really enjoyed reading, where you offer a list of traits that you developed, I think, as a result of visiting a lot of schools, maybe. You consider in chapter 5, the traits are your description, what you consider to be the hallmark of an innovative school and leader. So, and there are a lot of traits there. Again, I'm going to ask you to pick your favorites, if that's possible. Which ones do you consider to be the most essential?
Well, I don't know about most essential.
Yeah,
I don't know about most essential. That's hard because they kind of come together. And I am an ethnographic researcher by training, so what I share is descriptive, right? I'm not prescribing, but I'm simply describing what seems to be the pattern in these leaders. And so I'll share some that maybe 1 or 2 that might even be a little more controversial for some as they look at them. Now, to give a little context to it, this largely I was studying a lot of charter schools and magnet schools at the time. I'd visited 100 plus schools at that point, and I was looking for, what is it that causes this school to pop? What is it that causes it to be so sought after and distinctive and really seem to thrive? And certainly, as a qualitative researcher, others might look at it and say, well, did you really define thrive? Did you really define, what it means to be effective? And the answer in some ways is no. It was self-described. Is it a school that's thriving? People are seeking after it. There's people that want to be a part of it. It's a place where there's high morale among the students and the staff and the faculty. So yeah, there are some key traits that were consistent. So with that said, one of the things was that was a real, I use the word addiction, but maybe I shouldn't have used the word addiction, but a real commitment to seeking data and insight. And what was interesting to me from the leaders, though, is it wasn't all the same way. Some of the leaders were quite quantitative in the way that they were analyzing things and very systematic, but every one of them was constantly asking questions, and they wanted to know the good, bad, and the ugly. So they weren't hiding from questions that they didn't want to ask because they thought maybe it would reveal something that would be a lot of work or it'd be painful to hear or receive. That there was a true, genuine desire and interest in listening and learning and finding out what works or what doesn't. A good friend of mine and a leader of one of my favorite schools, school systems in the country, is a guy named Jeff Sandifer. And he helped start the Acton Academy in Austin, Texas, and there are a number of them. And so the K-12, but he also did Acton Business School, which is a very respected MBA program for entrepreneurs. And I remember I went and I visited his school one time, and we went out for lunch. And the first question he asked me when I visited the school was, "So what did you see? What?" There were questions. I don't remember the exact wording, but he was saying, "What can we work on? Is there anything that you saw that you think needed more attention?" So it was like he was seeking out the bad information almost. Like he wanted to know what wasn't working, or if I had any insights or observations that could allow him to improve. So that desire for constantly trying to grow and improve through real actionable insight and data is one that I really loved, and I enjoyed seeing that emerge. Now, on the flip side, another trait that was true in many of these schools, and pretty much all the school leaders, is a tough mindset. And I use the word tough because it's exactly the word that came out in my interviews and conversations. And it usually came out when I would ask a question like this. I would say, well, if you have someone who's not on board with where you're going, or you have someone that doesn't seem to get it, or they're not moving forward in unison, how do you approach that, or what do you do? And the response was often tough. Like, this is who we are. This is what we do. They're so incredibly committed to everybody being on board and that's why these are organizations that are very, very careful with how they hire and who they choose to add to the community, because they want people to be on board. And that speaks to maybe the third trait, which maybe I should have said first, is these are schools that have one or two, usually three at the most, unavoidable, undeniable school shaping concepts. And so there's something that everybody is around, and that's unavoidable, that no one can walk in the school, close their door, and avoid it. It permeates the whole place. It's undeniable because anyone could walk into the school and visit, and you can't miss it. It's just so prevalent, and it permeates everything so much that you can't miss it. And it's school shaping for that same reason, because it really does become the strainer that's used to sift through possibilities and options and decisions. So if you pick an option, an unavoidable, undeniable school shaping concept could be a school that decides we're going to be fully into a project-based learning vision of education. And you say, well, how do you make that unavoidable, undeniable school shaping? Well, you go to some of these places and they literally have no doors. It's not like you can close your door and do your own thing. They've actually designed the space in such a way that it speaks to and points to the unavoidable, undeniable school shaping concept. They develop norms and habits and a common vocabulary, a way of talking about and thinking about these things. And then in doing so, they build this really compelling culture that's tied to that core concept.
Yeah, those are all so good. One of my favorite traits that you talk about in chapter 5 is the thinking about the importance of embracing those wonderfully lopsided people in our midst. We all have them, every campus, every school, right? So why is that important from the perspective of innovation?
So the wonderfully lopsided piece is something that I've come to appreciate a lot. This is obviously in contrast to this notion that you want a well-rounded person, right? And in my mind, sometimes a well-rounded person becomes kind of like the jack of all trades type of person, and they don't seem to have a lot of weak points or anything like that. The problem is there are very, very few people like that in the world, maybe even if any. I mean, when you really get to know us, we're all wonderfully lopsided in one way or another. But I've found that there are people who have just immense gifts and passions in a particular area. And when you're really gifted in one area and you're putting a lot of time and energy in it, it means that sometimes you're not putting quite as much time and energy in other areas. So those might, from the perspective of some, feel or look a little underdeveloped. And the question is, well, okay, well, what do you do with a person like that? Do you have them spend all their time and energy on trying to develop the underdeveloped traits? Or is it possible that you invite them to lean in to that great strength and help them mitigate the downsides and the challenges? You obviously, if I'm just a persnickety personality that's really hard for people to get along with, and I'm just really, I'm rude and impolite to people. Yeah, that's something you can't ignore. That's gonna make a toxic culture over time if people are treating each other in an unkind way. So I don't mean by this that you totally disregard those kinds of things, but the idea is really investing in and acknowledging that a person who's truly gifted in certain areas, there's going to be a kind of quirkiness to us, and when you look at really high impact organizations and initiatives, you usually find these wonderfully lopsided people who are a part of it, and they're doing some incredible work. And you can build a team so that you complement one another. And of course, you have different kinds of strengths among the team, and it comes together in a powerful way.
Now, for leaders who want to nurture the innovator within, who want to become more innovative or entrepreneurial, what would you offer? Are there some personal practices or perspectives that somebody can nurture?
I think so. And one I learned a number of years ago, maybe I'd known it before, but it was affirmed when I was in a meeting. I was in a conference it was at Alverno College in Milwaukee. Alverno College is known for a really innovative, creative approach to assessment and authentic assessment. And they were hosting a session in the evening, and they had leaders in education in a panel. And they were talking about all these wonderful, exciting possibilities for the future of education. And there was a young woman in the audience who was in the teacher education program at Alverno College. And she raised her hand and she said, all of this is really exciting and interesting stuff, but where do I begin? Like, where do I start? And the first couple of people, honestly, on the panel that answered, I'm not sure if they directly answered the question the young woman was asking. But the third person, I think, hit it right on. And I could see the young woman in front of me nodding and really sort of receiving what he was saying. And he said this, and it's pretty simple. He said, your first step is to get informed about the possibilities. Because if you don't know what's possible, you'll find yourself constantly with every new problem or every situation, you're just going to go back to your existing toolbox of practices that you've seen and known from the past. And that's going to be your default. And many of us are wired that way, right? Our default as humans is not to innovate our way out of issues, at least for most of us. I think I'm wired a little bit differently, but that's for another conversation, perhaps. But most of us, we're wired to kind of default back to, what are the tried and tested practices and the heuristics that have worked in my life, that have worked in organizations I've been a part of, and so forth. And yet, this simple charge to get informed about the possibilities means be open and curious and look around. Look for ways that people are approaching problems and possibilities, and not even just in the space that you're working. In the education space, if you're in higher ed, look at K-12 and early childhood. If you're early childhood, look at higher ed. Look at engineering schools and higher ed and how they coordinate creative ways. If you're in, if you're in K-12 education, you may want to go to some architecture conferences or higher ed. You may want to go to conferences in healthcare, or you may want to go visit some other organizations that are not in your field. I was in Wisconsin for a while, and if I want to learn about a really interesting, innovative organization, why don't I go to Epic in Madison? It's this sort of healthcare behemoth. Find your way in visiting different places, and maybe even especially places that in your mind at first you don't think you'd be supportive of what they're doing. Like, allow yourself to just see, listen, observe, be deeply curious, ask questions, postpone judgment, and just sort of receive what you're seeing and let it kind of come in. And in doing this, you're going to begin to add some new kind of tools to that toolbox, that you'll develop some mental patterns. And so when you find yourself in a new situation, maybe you're not going to be wholly into applying what happened in this place that you you visited or you read about or you learned about, but you have a better chance of surfacing some possibilities that you wouldn't have otherwise.
Yeah, boy, and that's a great segue to my next question, because I know that leaders who are successful innovators uh, oftentimes can see opportunities, sometimes opportunities that are right in front of them that other people miss, but they can see them because of that mindset that they've cultivated of being able to see and connect dots between sometimes random disparate kinds of things. So how have you identified opportunities? I wonder if you have an example of something that you can share, and anything else that you would add. You've just given us some great advice for how to, how to expand your ability to think innovatively. But what about how to see good ideas on your campus in your school setting that might be right there in front of you?
Sure. The first one that comes to mind happened many, many years ago in the early years of kind of online learning. I've worked with online learning quite a bit off and on over the years. And I was leading a instructional design center at Concordia University, Wisconsin. That was one of my roles. And one of my roles was to help improve the quality and the sense of engagement in the online courses and help build it out for growth and expansion as well. And I had a nice small team, and we tried to nurture this sense of curiosity and this what if mentality, and asking that what if question. And so we immersed ourselves just in the data, and we were looking at one of the key factors that led to student interest and engagement, student satisfaction in an online course, was the amount of engagement they had with the professor. And was it authentic? Was it regular? Was it frequent? Was it meaningful? What was the nature of it? And the number one source of dissatisfaction for a student in an online course was when they felt like the instructor was absent. There was a lack of presence. And here's the part that was interesting, though. We had some data, and we were able to receive data at that time. Maybe today, I don't know if we would have done it this way. Maybe some of the faculty would have not like this, but we were able to see the average response time when the students would submit work, right? We were able to pull the data and find out. And we found that there were some faculty that were incredibly quick in giving feedback, like minutes and hours after a question was submitted, or we didn't look into emails. It was all like drop boxes mostly and things like that. But then we found something really interesting. Some of the faculty who seemed to be the slowest to reply, like even a week or two delay between a submission and the feedback, which clearly led to student dissatisfaction, were some of our rock star professors in the classroom. Oh. And that was a little baffling and confusing. Why is this? Why is this happening? So we got curious. And I just wandered around campus, and I looked around, and I kept an eye out for some of these faculty, just to kind of see them in their habitat. Why are they thriving? Why do the students love them so much in their face-to-face classes? And I saw a number of those faculty hanging out in the coffee shop, talking to students, helping them with their work afterward. I saw these faculty were hanging out with their students before and after class. Their office hours were packed with students who wanted to talk to them. And so then I stood back, and if you just think about this whole situation, and maybe the listeners could pause and say, okay, now this is the data that you have available to you. What do you do? Now let's back up. Let's say that you didn't do the watching and observing of the faculty. You just had some faculty are really slow in replying and others are really fast. What do you do? Now, an administrative decision might be, well, I'm going to mandate a 24-hour response time or else, right? Or you could come up with some other kind of policy. And maybe that would have worked in some places, and it might have worked well, right? And it does, and some schools do that. But by asking the next question, by being curious, we were able to discover that some of our best rated in-person faculty were some of the same people who seemed to have this problem online. That led us to another phase of curiosity, right? So that next phase of curiosity led us to looking in and trying to observe and learn from what made these faculty so great in their in-person. It's like the wonderfully lopsided thing, I guess, in a way you could say. Like, what made them so great in this other context or environment? And then, so by getting that third set of data, now we were able to say, okay, now, given what we see, what is the best path forward? And we begin to brainstorm at that point. What are the options? What are the experiments we could create? And I don't remember if it was me or another person in our team, but someone said, well, it seems like they like to talk. They like oral communication with the students. And when they're in the online system, they're forced into all written communication, because this was at the stage of the learning management system when there weren't options for recording video and audio feedback and so forth. This preceded that. And we all kind of noticed, and oh, that's true. What would happen if we gave these same faculty the ability to use their voice to communicate with students? And so we didn't have any tool at the time. There was no technology in our learning management system that would allow that. So then we posed the question to the team, well, what would it take for us to create something like this? That was a Friday. Come back on a Monday, one of our team members came in and said, I did it. I said, well, what did you do? And he said, well, remember on Friday we were talking about this? I coded a simple system that can plug in to the Dropbox so that when a student submits work, a faculty member can read it, press record, and simply talk to the student and then submit their feedback. So we put it out, we dropped it in, we put it out, and we tested it. And we found incredible results. We found that faculty were more likely to give frequent feedback, faster feedback. They were likely to give a greater volume of feedback. They were more likely to coach rather than just grade and assess. They were more likely to give examples, to give words of encouragement. They were more likely to be personal in their approach to the student. And the students were more likely to review the feedback multiple times, because we could see how many times it was played back. And the students felt a greater sense of connection with the professor, and they were more likely to use the feedback to improve subsequent work. That's an incredible result in my mind for simply being curious and simply approaching it. So, I mean, for me, that's a very easy, simple, small example of what can happen if you just lead with curiosity, asking questions, and not just jumping to your toolbox of solutions too early in the data set, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah, that's a brilliant example too. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that. Now, as you know, it's one thing to be an innovator or to have an innovative mind. It's something entirely different sometimes to effectively lead innovation and change in a campus community for all the reasons you've just so beautifully articulated. So what have you learned? I'm curious, because here you are in the hot seat as a president 2 times now. So what have you learned about nurturing an innovative spirit and culture and bringing along others, including those naysayers who exist on every campus, everywhere?
Yeah, and I'm still learning a great deal about this all the time. I'm humbled by my role, in fact. I mean, you know the Drucker quote that culture eats strategy for breakfast. I love a good strategy. I mean, I love strategic planning. Here at my organization, we've created a 1-page strategic plan, front and back side. None of these big, long binders that collect dust on the shelf. It's a very focused, clear plan. I think we generally have people on board with it, and they feel like, yeah, these are good things for us to prioritize. This is going to lead us in a good direction to a good and promising, hopeful future. And so I personally have, this is maybe one of my flaws in leadership, is if I see a really good, compelling plan and I get a sense that people are on board, I want to just run forward. Let's go. But that's not how it works in real culture, because there's all of this history and this baggage, and baggage makes it sound sometimes negative, but I mean, there's this history, there are these norms, there are competing values, there are competing priorities, there are fears, there are things that people joyfully love and they want to protect them and make sure that they're not lost. And all of that's really complex. And I will say that I'm just not convinced that there is an amazing leader that can step into any organization and make things right. Great leaders fail all the time. Amazing leaders fail all the time. I believe I love the Annie Duke, her book. I think it's called Making the Bets, where she says that leadership is probably more like poker than chess, because in chess, if you play all the moves right, you have a very, very high chance of success. But in poker, you have to play your hand. And even if you play your hand perfectly, you're going to fail a certain percentage of the time. And sometimes you can fail abysmally and publicly in an embarrassing way. And I appreciate that. That's why I'm so drawn to the idea of noble quests and missional moonshots, because those are ones where you count the cost from the beginning and you say, hey, in the worst case scenario, am I willing to pursue this, even given the possibility of this worst case scenario? Like stepping into Goddard, am I willing to step into this? I could be the last president of a school that I love dearly and would hate to see disappear. And all those jobs would disappear, and all those people would be disappointed, and the students and the alumni, and man, that would be horrible. But boy, is it worth trying to save and make happen and get to a place of flourishing. Like, to me, that's a really important place for leadership, is to count the cost up front. Because and maybe as I learn more as a leader, I'll figure out that there are more predictable ways of transforming and shaping culture so that you have a much, much higher chance of success. A lot of my work over the years has honestly been a kind of charge to help organizations move quickly when there's not adequate time for a full culture shift. So they have to be able to innovate even when you don't have necessarily full buy-in. And a lot of my work over the years has been on that. So in those contexts, by the way, you have lots of options. You choose to create intentional silos, which are controversial, but they work in many places, where you can create a team that's insulated from the rest of the culture and give them the resources and space to be able to launch something and incubate it and grow it so that it's strong and can stand on its own before you let the rest of the culture at it. Otherwise, what will happen is the rest of the culture will always just kind of pull it back into its own norms. So there is that approach that can be used. You can seek the coalition of the willing approach that works sometimes, where you realize you don't need everyone, but you need this strong coalition of the willing who are going to move forward. Kind of draws from like Everett Rogers models of diffusion of innovation. You're never going to have your bleeding edge people are not going to convince your laggards. There's too much of a difference in the way they think and look at the world. But you can get those people that are maybe a step away from the bleeding edge, one or two phases away. You can have some buy-in with them. So building that coalition of the willing. I've found a lot of value in spending time and investing in those who are, in the technology space, I would call them neo-Luddites, the people who are sort of skeptical of the new fad or the new technology or the new innovation. And I've found some of my best ideas have come from actually having lunch with folks and really genuinely listening to what their concerns are and what they love about education or something else. And sometimes I've been able to take ideas from that, and we've been able to infuse it into the innovation and make it better. So building trusting, positive relationships, even with people who aren't going to be fully bought in, and showing respect for people. The nuclear kinds of options that exist are interesting, because when I first started studying innovative K-12 schools, I realized it sure seems a lot easier to start new than to redirect or rewire an existing school. And it seems to be consistently true that if you can start a new org and you can build your culture from the scratch and be really careful about who you add to the water and who you hire, then there are possibilities. There's a different path forward that can be really exciting and invigorating for everybody. And I've even seen people do shutdowns. Like, I know this is controversial, but I've seen in school environments where they felt like the school culture was just not agile and just maybe even increasingly toxic. And so they shut the whole school down and they rehire from scratch in a year or two. And I mean, that's, again, those are options that people don't want to look at. But when I'm still trying to figure some of this out in terms of, okay, now how do you take an existing community and build it to a real culture of innovation where people are consistently and almost universally excited and positive about the new initiatives and the new innovations that you're pursuing. Of course, there are some basics to doing that we all know. When people have inadequate resources, they're going to feel overwhelmed and they're going to be bitter and frustrated whenever you're trying to move forward without adequate resources. If people are feeling like that means time as well. People have adequate time. Do people feel well equipped for the work or not? And are we getting the training that we need? Or are we bringing in the expertise that we need to help us build the competence and confidence to move forward? So there's some things like that. Spending time to really ground ourselves in a set of shared values. What are the values that we're all committed to, and how do we hold one another accountable to those regularly? And that's good. I mean, Melissa, that's kind of, you probably do a lot of that work in your teaching and helping people explore how to lead some of those culture shifts.
Well, I have to say your observations are very much in keeping with what I read and what I learn from watching and talking to other people. It's there. I think the challenge you identified of how do you do this with an existing culture where the culture is very deeply ingrained and you have the norms and the values, it's a much more difficult thing. And I find leaders who try to do that work to be very humble after they've been doing it for a while because of just how challenging it is. So maybe that can be your next book when you get ready to go back to writing.
If I figure it out, or maybe my book will be how to survive once you've failed from that. So we'll see.
My experience as a poker player, I think, would be a great
there you
book
go.
title. So we have one final question. We have a signature question we ask of every guest, and I'm putting a unique twist on the question for you. So as a futurist who encourages moonshot thinking, what's a future moonshot that you have on your mind that you hope expect to see educators taking on in maybe the not so distant future?
I think it's interesting to me because I don't really buy into the silver bullet approach to thinking about the future of education. And as a result, what strikes me as the most compelling future of education is one that is a beautiful, diverse ecosystem of different models and approaches, all inspired by the same commitment to a more hopeful, humane, inspiring education system for each and every learner. And so to me, the part that's most exciting is I love seeing spaces where we can create room for lots of kind of pockets of innovation. Even sometimes they're standing alongside one another that are competing. The K-12 space is an interesting one, and listeners may have different views on charter schools, but you don't have to be an advocate for or against charter schools. The concept of the charter school originally was meant to be an experimentation on a different model to test it, and if it's effective, then to transfer those lessons into the legacy school systems. And that was a part of the original vision for charter schools. But we've also had magnet schools and other things like that on the K-12 level. In the higher ed space, we haven't seen quite as much of that. We've seen some of it. Goddard was part of this league of experimental colleges. And I see a lot of promise and possibility in these kind of micro innovations of creating this beautiful, beautiful garden of different models and approaches to education, acknowledging that there is no one model or approach that's going to meet the needs of every person, that we come as wonderfully unique people, and we're going to benefit from different types and approaches of education. I'm not talking about learning styles here. That's a whole nother. I'm just talking about the fact that there are very, very different lived experiences and people, very different people. So my hope in the higher ed space particularly is to see much more of that. We only have 9 work colleges in the entire country that are official work colleges in the whole US in operation right now. And there is a lesson and a concept from the work college model that has incredible promise to blow away many of the financial concerns that exist in higher education. And we have yet to tap into that. I would love to see 24 experiments in that space alone. And I'm hinting at the fact that maybe I'm at a place that's hoping to launch and announce something like that within the next year. But that's one that I think has great promise. The other thing is to take lessons from these K-12 schools that can apply to higher ed, where you create these really distinct cultures, academic cultures and communities, where people kind of find their people with shared passions and interests. And you can have a lot of sort of school within a school models. And some would argue that you already have that in universities with different colleges and so forth. But if people would just take a little time and look at what's happened in some of the K-12 spaces with these, I think their imagination would be would lead them to some new options that could be really compelling for the future of higher ed.
Wow, what a great note to end on. And I'm going to look forward to what sounds like a big announcement that might be coming in the next several months from Seward, Nebraska. So listeners can stay tuned. That's very exciting. So Bernard, thank you so very much for your time. Our conversation was just so valuable and inspiring. Your thoughts about innovation and the setting in which you are now in, where you are living it, is very, very informative. So thank you. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.